How do I explain asexuality to other people? Let's talk about it.
How it's supposed to feel.
So when I first came out as asexual, I was surprised by something that happened during that process. I like to think of myself as pretty good with words. I'm a writer. I've been a writer forever. I was also a teacher for a really long time. So, explaining things and using language to get my point across is something I felt very comfortable with. But during that first stretch of time when I was coming out as ace, I had a really hard time explaining asexuality to people when I would come out. People naturally have a ton of questions about asexuality because they just don't know very much about it. And as an asexual person, they're really looking to you to have all the answers. And when I was placed in that position, I found that I had a hard time having all the answers. So I spent some time really thinking through this explanation, figuring out what I like to call my asexuality lecture when I come out to people, a way of explaining asexuality that helps people understand it, answer some of their major questions, some of their frequent questions, and communicates to the best of my ability what asexuality is to someone who doesn't know very much about it. So what I hope this video can do is help you better articulate what asexuality is to the people in your life that you're coming out to, especially when those people don't know very much about asexuality or maybe hold some misconceptions that can cause some confusion between you. So let's start with the most basic question: what is asexuality? So this is the definition I always use when someone asks me what is asexuality. Asexuality is a sexual orientation that includes anyone who does not or rarely experiences sexual attraction. Now, that definition sounds pretty simple, right? But as we know, as members of the asexual community, that simple definition belies a really deep complexity in the community and in the asexual experience. Asexuality is actually very complicated and contains a lot of different kinds of experiences and a lot of different relationships to sexual activity. So that simple definition, which is very simple on its face, is actually a lot more complicated in practice. And that's part of why it's really confusing for people who don't know much about asexuality. This definition appears very simple, but we know that asexuality thinks about the things that surround sexual orientation and our relationship to sex itself in a lot more complicated ways than most allosexual people think about their relationship to those things. So, allo folks tend to not really think any sexual orientation should be that complicated. So they're looking at asexuality through this very simplified lens, a lens that reflects their experience of allosexuality. So part of what we can do when we are talking to people about asexuality and explaining it to them is break down some of those seemingly simple ideas and reveal a little bit of the complexity to help them better understand how asexuality fits into the larger picture of human experience. So why don't we dive in and answer the next question: what is sexual orientation? Sexual orientation, broadly, is an individual's innate pattern of experience of sexual attraction over time. Now, depending on the lens through which you're thinking through these things, there are other ways we can describe or define sexual orientation. In some corners of queer theory, you can argue that sexual orientation is not innate, that it's a choice, and there are other ways that theorists and academics and researchers think about sexual orientation. But for our purposes here, and for the purpose of having conversations with the people in your lives, this definition will do. It's an innate pattern of experience of sexual attraction over time. And this suggests three key questions that we ask about ourselves. What feels like it comes from within? What feels innate? What feelings feel like they've always been there? What feelings feel like we didn't choose them necessarily? Where is my sexual attraction going? Is this attraction directed at other genders? Is it directed at my own gender? All genders? No genders? Does gender even matter in where it's going? This direction helps us find a language for our sexual orientation. And finally, what patterns do I see in that experience? Is this attraction always there, moving in one direction? Is it always there, but continually switching up its direction? Is it never there, sometimes there? Is it all over the place? Does it keep changing up? What are the patterns that we experience over time? So we're not talking about one experience in the moment, we're talking about a cumulative experience over time. And those three key questions help us distinguish and understand our sexual orientation. So, sexual orientation isn't just thinking about I'm into this kind of person. It's a more complicated idea than that. It contains these three ideas and gives us a way to think about sexual orientation that is more broad and more encompassing for a person than just I'm into that person. So these three questions lead us to two main ideas under this large umbrella that is sexual orientation: allosexuality and asexuality. So, allosexuality contains all of the orientations that do regularly experience sexual attraction. So, heterosexuality, homosexuality, bisexuality, pansexuality, omnisexuality. If you are regularly experiencing sexual attraction, you're allosexual. Most people situate their experience in allosexuality, but that doesn't mean that allosexuality is a default setting for human beings. It is more common, yes, but allosexuality is just one of a set of ways that human beings can experience attraction and move through the world. On the other side of the spectrum is asexuality, folks who don't or rarely experience sexual attraction. And what's important here is the distinction that asexuality is not an absence of sexual orientation. There isn't allosexuality and then an absence of it, which we call asexuality. Asexuality is its own thing. It is a sexual orientation in and of itself, wholly and fully, just as allosexuality is. And asexuality, like all things human, is a spectrum. And the umbrella of asexuality contains four big tent identities, so to speak. These four identity markers attempt to cover a whole range of experiences inside asexuality in a broad way. There's asexual, which does double duty. It's both the umbrella term for our whole spectrum of experience, but it also means people who don't experience sexual attraction. They're gray asexual or gray sexual folks, and this identity marker describes the experience of people who only sometimes experience sexual attraction, but mostly don't. And gray asexual can also include people who do experience sexual attraction, but experience it at such a low level that it doesn't really matter for them. So they're maybe not comfortable saying they're asexual, but gray sexual works for them. This is for anyone who feels their relationship to sexual attraction sits in between allo and ace. They're demisexual folks, people who only experience sexual attraction when they have established an emotional connection with someone. When they don't have an emotional connection with someone, there isn't an experience of sexual attraction. It only exists when they are connected to someone emotionally. And then there's ace flux. And this is a word that describes people whose relationship to sexual attraction changes. So sometimes there's no experience of it. Sometimes they do. Sometimes they are feeling allosexual. Sometimes they're feeling maybe demisexual or asexual. What is important to ace flux folks is that their experience of sexual orientation is a constantly shifting thing. It's always moving. So that is the key identifier for ace flux. And beyond that, there are the micro labels, which are more specific words that describe very specific experiences of sexual attraction or describe people's relationship to sexual activity. The micro labels exist because for some people under the asexual spectrum, those kind of four big words don't quite communicate their experience enough for them. And they are looking for words that more specifically describe how they are moving through the world. And the micro labels provide these people something else too, which all labels provide, which is a better opportunity to find other people who experience asexuality in the same way. So, now, probably in your first conversations with people, you aren't going to get into the details of labels, but I think it's helpful to understand the progression from sexual orientation to allosexuality and asexuality, and then being able to break it down under how asexuality then breaks down even further. For someone who is interested, for someone who's vibing with your explanation, you'll be able to maybe get into more of those nitty gritty details, but it's just good to keep them in mind even if you don't actually get there. So now let's tackle the most confusing part of this for most people. What is sexual attraction? So the definition I always use for sexual attraction is pretty straightforward. Sexual attraction is the attraction one feels toward a person or a kind of person that makes you want to have sex with them. Now, like the definition of asexuality, the definition of sexual attraction is pretty straightforward, but it's way more complicated than that. If you've had any conversations about asexuality with someone who knows nothing about it, this point right here makes people's heads explode. Sexual attraction gets confused with a lot of things. So it'll be helpful here to break down the three elements of our experience with sex and attraction that are going to really help make this more clear. And that's talking about the difference between arousal, libido, and attraction. So arousal is the feeling in the moment of your body waking up and your mind waking up to be ready for sex. Now, it can have a cause in the world, or it can just show up without warning at all. But what is important to understand about arousal is its specificity to the moment. Arousal is the thing that's happening right now, in your body and in your mind. Libido is different. Libido is a way for us to think about the intensity and frequency of arousal. So libido is whether or not arousal is intense or less intense, if it's happening all the time or only happening now and then. You can think of libido as the volume settings on your sexual response. So high libido folks will experience arousal intensely and often. Low libido folks will experience arousal less intensely and less frequently. Attraction is a way for us to think about where that libido is directed. Who is the person or the kind of person that these feelings are being directed toward? Is it the same gender, different genders, no gender, all genders? The directionality of these feelings, particular to you, is described by attraction. They often say if libido is your volume settings, attraction is your particular song. I find being able to explain these three terms to be enormously helpful in talking to people about asexuality, because I think they're often the most confusing ones for people. Often we think of these three ideas, arousal, libido, and attraction, to be all wrapped up together. They're all one thing, but they're not. They're separate ideas. And to give people that context and that understanding about the differences between them helps make asexuality a bit more clear. And that leads us to the final question that we usually get when explaining asexuality to others. So what does that mean for sex? This is something people are so obsessed about, whether or not asexual people have sex. The answer I always give is always very straightforward. Asexuality has nothing to do with whether or not a person has sex. Asexuality has everything to do with whether or not they experience a sexual attraction. So asexual people can have sex if they choose to. Asexual people can also choose not to have sex. But those things are not connected to each other. Having sex doesn't make you not asexual. Not having sex doesn't make you asexual. So usually if in this conversation with someone we get to the dreaded sex question, the questions that can follow up can be a little invasive. So here's a little something that I always say to people when I find that their questions about sex get a little too invasive. I always tell people, I am happy to talk to you about asexuality in the theoretical, but I am uncomfortable and unwilling to talk to you about the mechanics of it in my life. So, we'll be happy to talk all day about how asexuality works, what asexual people are like. We can talk about the language, we can talk about the ideas behind it. But in general, I am not going to be so open to just talking to anybody about how my personal relationship to my asexuality works within my life and with my partners. Happy to talk about the ideas. I'm not going to talk about the mechanics. And that generally is a very polite and kind way to deflect someone's insensitive and invasive question. I use that statement frequently, and people respond to it very well, and it tends to work. So I know that was a lot of information all in one video, but I hope everything here gives you some language, gives you some structure, and gives you some confidence to talk more about asexuality to people who don't understand it. Coming out is a challenging thing when you're an asexual person, in large part because so few people know what asexuality is. And there's a lot of pressure to not only reveal something personal about yourself, but then have to be the educator about that thing to the people around you. What I really am hopeful is that this is going to help you out in that process and make that part, the explaining part, a little easier for you. As always, thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.